Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Black Mirror Season 4, Episode 4, Hang the DJ. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review Season 4 of Black Mirror one episode at a time. This video is where I cover the episode Hang the DJ. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Hang the DJ. If you haven't seen this episode, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. However, this video will not contain spoilers from other episodes of Black Mirror, except there will be some mild spoilers for the USS Callister and San Junipero. So if you haven't seen those episodes and are highly sensitive about spoilers, you may want to skip this video until you've seen those episodes, but for everyone else, this is safe from spoilers for other episodes. So as I mentioned in a previous video, I think every episode of Black Mirror Season 4, with the exception of one, Archangel, is great. Meaning I think this episode is great. I think this is one of the better episodes of Black Mirror overall. But, that being said, it does seem like I'm not as big into this episode as many others appear to be, as I heard many state this was either the best or second best episode of the season, and that appears to be a very common opinion, whereas I would place this at either the fifth or fourth best episode of the 6-episode season. I still haven't decided. I'll have to wait until I watch Metalhead again next week to see which of these two episodes I like better, but they're kind of very close on the scale for me. But bear in mind, I think this is a great season overall, so the fifth best out of 5 great episodes isn't necessarily a low rating. It would just be slightly less great than the other greatness, if that makes any sense. Regardless, I am likely to be a bit harsher on this episode than many others are, therefore it may appear that I'm being negative, so I do want to keep emphasizing that I love this episode. So, an interesting aspect of Season 4 is that this season, perhaps more than any other season of Black Mirror, has a feature where each episode has a very different and distinct genre, and perhaps that's why this season is more polarizing than others and feature episodes a lot of people don't like, because the genre range is so different here. So it makes sense not all episodes will appeal to everyone. So Episode 1 is a space opera / cyber science fiction thriller. Episode 2 is a coming-of-age indie drama. Episode 3 is a dark suspense episode. Episode 5 is a post-apocalyptic thriller. Episode 6 is an ironic horror anthology like Tales from the Crypt. But this episode is a romantic comedy, and this is the first time Black Mirror did this, so it is interesting to see a romantic comedy giving the Black Mirror spin. And I must say, this is one of my favorite romantic comedies I've ever seen. I didn't like it as much as The Big Sick, which was one of my favorite movies to come out in 2017. I'd highly recommend seeing it. But again, that was a bit of an anomaly, as I typically don't like romantic comedies, as typically they're very formulaic, predictable, and offer nothing original. This episode and The Big Sick are huge exceptions in my opinion. And I have to be honest, when I was thinking about all the flaws that I have with this episode, I almost considered dropping my rating for this episode, but then I watched it again and found myself in tears by the end of the episode and realizing how much this episode moves me. And so I do have to admit, this is a great episode and I can see why so many people love it. What makes this episode stand out isn't just the Black Mirror sci-fi aspect to it, but also the tremendous chemistry between the main characters. This is something that every romantic comedy strives for, but few actually accomplish. And the way the story was structured was perfect, as it really gets you to feel the plight of these two characters, as it clearly shows the extreme chemistry that they have and how perfect they are for each other, as well as showing them in other relationships that clearly do not work to one degree or another. We see Frank in a year-long relationship with someone who is contemptible and clearly doesn't like him, really showcasing how bad it could be, while Amy's experiences are more nuanced, where she doesn't despise the person that she's with for a long time, but she doesn't feel anything for him or really connect to him in the way she does with Frank. And then she gets put into a series of short flings repeatedly, which kind of desensitizes her. So by the time they meet up again, they're extremely happy to see each other again. And while it is kind of a trope that every romantic comedy that towards the end of the second act, the couple needs to have a falling out where the relationship falls apart, and then the third act is them overcoming the obstacle and getting back together. And I must admit, even though intellectually I knew this was part of an overused cliche formula, it is still extremely effective. When Frank looked at the timer and it kept going down, I must admit that was extremely effective and my heart just sank. So that was actually a really good tense scene. And Amy's reaction to learning about this was completely understandable and believable, and so the tension between them was completely came off really great and didn't come off as contrived as most romantic comedies tend to do. There are so many romantic comedies that I've seen where at the end of the second act relationship troubles come into play, and I think, oh my god, that's so contrived, that's so predictable, that's so dumb, so obvious, they're just throwing in obstacles so they can overcome. But I didn't think that here at all, because it was really well constructed. And then there's the fantastical setting of the episode, as from the very beginning you can tell there's something off about the setting, as it seems to be this isolated village where the prime focus is to find a partner. The characters talk to this AI that sounds like Alexa, known as Coach, that basically tells them what to do, as they are assigned relationships that they have to engage in for a certain amount of time that's allocated by Coach. And then you hear from others who've apparently had success with the system telling people to stick with the system because it works, as apparently once you're assigned your permanent life partner, you leave the settlement together forever into the great unknown. So this gives the story a sort of fantastical feel to it, and that of course you don't really know what's going on until the end of the episode. And then, of course, there's the guys with the tasers, whom the episode emphasizes from time to time, who are apparently there to enforce that everyone follows the rules. I heard others compare this episode to the film Defending Your Life, which is another one of my favorite romantic comedies. It's a film from the early 90s with Albert Brooks and Meryl Streep about people after they die going to this place where their life is scrutinized in a courtroom scenario to determine if they can move on to the next stage of existence or if they have to return to Earth to give it another go. And in this film, the Albert Brooks character falls in love with the Meryl Streep character, who is ultimately deemed worthy of moving on to the next level where Brooks is sent back to Earth, but because of their love, he defies all bounds and he breaks the rules and tries to go with Meryl Streep anyway. And the higher-ups are so impressed with his valor that they allow him to do it. So I can definitely see similarities. This has that same love defies all bounds feel to it when Frank and Amy decide to break the rules and run off together. And the scene where Amy puts her hand to the taser and finds out that it's harmless was actually a really stunning scene. And then seeing them race off together was very powerful and a great adventure. Also focusing more on the comedy aspects of this romantic comedy, that's very effective as well. This has moments of comedy that blend perfectly into the story and only enhance it. Most of them being in the main characters, Frank and Amy's sense of humor, which seems to be the biggest thing that they have in common, and this leads to a lot of lighthearted and funny scenes. But even outside of their interactions, we get a lot of well-executed humor. One of the icons of this episode that I reference all the time with my friends is Amy's partner, who always goes, "Ah." It was particularly funny that after we see that Amy is getting irritated with that, she has this romantic encounter with him where he goes down on her, and after that we hear him go, "Ah," and her face just sinks, and that was just hilarious. Also, I was constantly wondering where I recognized that actor from, because he looks so familiar, but I couldn't place him, so I finally looked him up. and he was the guy who played Athelstan on Vikings. Of course, that makes so much sense. I guess it was just weird seeing him in this modern context. Anyway, another hilarious moment is shortly after Frank and Amy had their big falling out. We see Frank telling the story of their falling out and how heartbroken he is, but then we zoom out to see that who he's talking to, and it's a girl who's going down on him. That's very funny. And then they both agree to, think about their ex-lovers while they have sex. I suppose if you think about it, it makes sense that the system would pair up two heartbroken people who are just thinking of other people together. And just like any other episode of Black Mirror, this episode features great cinematography, great editing, and otherwise just high production value. This to me shines through the most in the scene after her fallout with Frank. We see a montage of Amy with a bunch of men and a woman as she just stands there, but the men just fade in and out. And this was a beautiful montage that perfectly portrayed the hollowness she felt of just going to one fling after another, and I thought it was brilliant. And of course, the use of the title song, Hang the DJ, at the end of the episode was a perfect use of a song, as it really punctuates the ending and hits home that heartfelt feeling that makes you feel all warm inside. And of course, also the song's meaning describes the feelings of rebelliousness that were just depicted in this episode. And speaking of the episode's happy ending, I've heard some complain that this didn't feel Black Mirror-y, or that the fact this episode has a happy ending is a twist, because you wouldn't expect a Black Mirror episode to have a happy ending. Do these people not remember San Junipero? It's already been established that Black Mirror can have happy endings. Hell, even earlier this season, we get a happy ending with the USS Callister. So I totally disagree. This was a surprise that it was a happy ending. In fact, when I first saw the trailer for Season 4, even before I watched the season, I could tell just by the clips that this episode would be a happy episode, would have a happy ending, just like San Junipero. That being said, San Junipero did have elements of sadness to it, whereas this episode was in general more lighthearted and upbeat, but that's fine. I am continually bemused by people who constantly say that one episode or another just didn't feel Black Mirror, or it wasn't Black Mirror enough to him. I don't really understand that. Black Mirror is a broad show that encompasses a lot of feelings, a lot of genres, a lot of tones, so I disagree with the whole concept that an episode doesn't feel Black Mirror enough. They are all Black Mirror. Okay, so now let me get into the issues I had with this episode, which I do want to re-emphasize. I think this episode is great for the reasons I just mentioned, but there were some issues I think hold this back from being the best of the season, or as great as many others make it out to be. And pretty much all of those reasons revolve around the ending twist, the revelation that the whole thing is a simulation on a dating app. I didn't hate this per se, but I think it could have been handled better, and I must admit, when this reveal happened, it left a sour taste in my mouth. Chief among them is, I was disappointed that more time was not spent clearing up exactly what the simulation was, as I was still very unclear on it. I wasn't sure if the real life Frank and Amy experienced these simulations, or if they just had avatars and they have no knowledge of the simulation, or maybe they're aware they have avatars in the simulation, but they don't know what happened. I think the episode could have spent more time making this clear. And I'll get the inevitable, that would be anticlimactic, which absolutely is not the case, because they could have cleared this up in one line of dialogue, just one. I don't think it would be anticlimactic at all to see real life Frank and real life Amy's first interaction. I think it would add a lot to the ending. And there's also the inevitable false dichotomy argument, saying, "What, Mark? Do you want a scientist to come out and give a detailed lecture on how the dating app works?" No, that's not what I want at all. As I said, all they need is just one line of dialogue that sums up how real life Frank and real life Amy are using the app. That's all they need, and this would have made the episode so much better in my eyes. So now that I had time to think about this episode and watch videos on it, I do get they were implying that this was a simulation used by the dating app, and that real life Frank and Amy didn't experience these experiences at all. However, they are aware that the dating app ran these simulations, therefore the 98.8% match carries a lot of weight to it, a lot more weight than, say, like modern dating apps. It means that this 98.8% makes it extremely likely they will get along and possibly become lifelong partners, which is why they smile when they see each other. But the reason why I was considering that they did remember what went down in the simulation was the way they were looking at each other, and Frank looked almost teary-eyed, but apparently that was just because he knew the app found him a perfect match. But me personally, after having just gone through this really engaging and enthralling adventure, it would carry a lot more weight with me if real-life Frank and Amy pertained some memories of these experiences. To me, that would be a lot more heartwarming than simply an app finding them a match. Also, I heard other people talk about the great surprise twist that shocked everyone when it was revealed the whole thing was a simulation. But I have to think to myself, was anyone actually surprised by this? I've had a hard time believing that people were actually surprised by this ending. I, for one, wasn't the least bit surprised because the fact that they were in a simulation was far too telegraphed. I mean, I saw this one video that talked about all the clues that hinted that they were in a simulation, but they didn't hint at it. They outright told you. In fact, Frank does in fact spell it out point blank by saying, "What if we're in a simulation?" And when I first heard that line felt so out of place and awkward, unless they actually are in a simulation. So at that stage, I think the most surprising ending would have been if they were not in a simulation, because that was far too obvious. I mean, they outright told you. And this is confirmed by the whole, like, skipping stones thing, how it skips 4 times every single time. She points this out, like, several times. So I know that every episode doesn't necessarily need to have a surprising ending. So predictable endings can be good at times, but I don't think this is one of those cases, because the way they present the whole ending is if it should be surprising, which it isn't. So I would say they did a horrible job, far too obvious job at foreshadowing. And the other thing is, Frank and Amy talk about how it seems like they're experiencing these things over and over again, like they've been through this a lot of times before, and that they had this instant connection as soon as they met each other, which, when you think about it, I don't know, it doesn't make too much sense. Does each simulation keep memories of the last one? See, this just reminded me of, like, other foreshadowing things like time loops and other sci-fi stuff I've seen, but it seems a bit more sort of cliched and unfocused here and doesn't actually map up. Also, in the end, Amy asks, what if they were meant to rebel, and that's their ultimate goal? So they rebel. So doesn't this diminish the results then, that Frank and Amy don't rebel because they're in love, but because of some sense of obligation, or sense that they've done this before, and some sense that they're supposed to? And for that matter, if everything they experience in the simulation is meant to push them to the result of rebelling, doesn't that taint the results and render them meaningless, because the simulation is pushing them towards a result? Doesn't mean that the real life Frank and Amy would act this way in real life. And they were meant to spend 5 years together, and the whole reason they were forced to rebel is because Frank looked at the expiry date without Amy. So does that mean he looked at that expiry date in all 1,000 simulations? What if he didn't, and the two of them actually agreed to look immediately? Would it say 20 hours instead of 5 years? If so, the whole thing's rigged. And overall, I'm not sure how accurate these results are, because the simulation as Frank and Amy interacting in isolation in this fake environment where their sole purpose is to be in relationship. This doesn't take into account, like, hobbies, work obligations, real life family responsibilities and pressure, financial difficulties and compatibilities, because really a long-term relationship is far more complex than what's presented in the simulation. So it could be that real life Frank and Amy don't get along at all. And to further piss all over your parade, if you compare this episode to the episode USS Callister, where the simulated people are portrayed as sentient and deserving to live, this means that 1,000 sentient digital copies of Frank and Amy are being killed every time they fall in love and escape. It's kind of a tragedy if you think about it in those terms. So ultimately what I'm saying is I feel the big twist could have been done better. I would have preferred something other than, oh, they were in a simulation the whole time, which is something Black Mirror has done repeatedly before, and as I said, was foreshadowed a bit too heavily. And I dare say this great, engaging, and moving episode could have been even more powerful with a different ending, but that's just my feelings on the matter. So my rating for Hang the DJ out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. As I said, this was an extremely effective romantic comedy, one of the best I've ever seen, that really gets you invested and involved in the story that's pulled off so well. The overpowering chemistry between the two leads and the very effective way the story is pulled off works so well. And I must admit to being very emotionally impacted by the ending of the episode, which really does bring the feels. But the big revelation that they were in a simulation for a dating app, that could have been handled better, and it left me with a sour taste in my mouth. And frankly, the more I think about this episode, the more flaws I find with it, which is never an ideal situation. So this is still a great and well executed episode, but not perfect. So that's it for my review of Hang the DJ. Next week I will conclude my coverage of Black Mirror Season 4, as I will review the final 2 episodes of Season 4 in the same week. I'll do separate videos for them, of course, but we'll release both videos next week, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. Also be sure to check out my channel, as I do videos on the other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Discovery, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.